Talk about, at the Pentagon, the culture at the Pentagon, and the clackers.
See, she gathers intel over dinner. She has you. The story I told was, the Pentagon is a very male-dominated environment, as you can imagine. When I first served there in the Clinton administration, we had a women's leadership lunch, and we basically fit around one of these tables. And for weeks, there were conspiracy theories. What were they all talking about? Why did they get together? Fast forward to the Obama administration, and you could probably fill this room with women who were in leadership ranks in the Pentagon. And we finally got to the critical mass. You know you've arrived when someone creates a nickname for you. So they started calling women in the Office of the Secretary of Defense the clackers, because the heels of our shoes would hit the floor, and people knew we were coming.
And if you've been in the Pentagon, imagine the echoes down the halls of the clackers coming.
The feared clackers. Yes.
And I wanted to start with that because it sounds to me like a sitcom, the clackers. And a little known detail about Michèle is that she actually grew up on sitcom sets in Southern California, going to Beverly Hills High, where her high school played my high school in football, but you don't remember that apparently. But tell us why you were on the set of sitcoms and what that was like.
My father was a cinematography director at Paramount Studios. And so he worked on The Lucy Show, which those of you who are my age may remember, and then The Odd Couple. My parents had also separated when I was young, and so on Fridays, which was shooting day, was often the time when I would go over to be with my dad for the weekend, and so I would end up doing my homework, on the set while he was getting ready to film.
And then your dad passed away when you were just 12 years old.
14.
14.
Yeah.
How did that affect you once again? Somebody's overcome hardship to be where you are today. Tell us about that.
It was, devastating. It was collapse of my world. We were very close, but what it gave me is a sense of the preciousness of life. I mean, when most children feel immortal. You don't confront mortality. And when someone you're so close to dies suddenly and unexpectedly, it gives you a sense of, I better use the time I have and make sure I make the most of it.
But your family, much like Senator Murray's, also went through a financial strain, even though you were living in Beverly Hills.
Yeah, we lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Beverly Hills.
Yeah, and your mom had to struggle.
Yeah, and we were there for, my mom's value was education. That she got us one block inside the city line for the best public school district at the time in Southern California. And that was her strategy to take care of us even when the whole financial floor dropped out from under us.
And you ended up moving into the national security realm. How were you drawn to that?
I was first drawn to things international. I had the good fortune to be an exchange student in Belgium. I went there to perfect my French and got placed in a Flemish family, but it was still an amazing, amazing experience that kind of opened my eyes, at age 16 to the world. And so from that point forward, I really knew I wanted to do something international. And it was really pursuing first undergraduate and then graduate education, and eventually coming to Washington to work, where I sort of really started focusing on the national security dimension.
And it's interesting because we were talking at our table about how so many young women, like you mentees today, want a roadmap to success. I mean, when I was at the Kennedy School, these young women would flock around wanting the exact steps to take, to which I would say, well, in different terms, stuff happens. You don't necessarily have a direct linear line. You were actually stringing for Time magazine and thought you'd be a journalist at one point.
Yeah, so I needed to help put myself through college, and so in addition to, like Senator Murray, I was a huge beneficiary of those wonderful student loans, but I also had to work, and so I was a stringer for Time magazine. Thank you, Time representatives, whoever here. And I really loved that, but I also knew that it would take me many, many years to get to the point where I was doing sort of international relations or policy type of interviews. That first I had to start, you know, at a different level. And so when I came out of graduate school, I was, you know, working in think tanks. At one point I was up at Harvard at the think tank there. And while I was doing my fellowship and working on nuclear nonproliferation by day, I was still interning and moonlighting at WGBH, the public television station, by night, because I couldn't decide what side of the interview I wanted to be on.
And
then eventually, when I had the opportunity to go into the Clinton administration, it was sort of decided. I really had an opportunity to experience the policy world, in the world of public service, and then I was hooked.
So you're really more than a Pentagon bureaucrat. You're very much a big thinker. I mean, you came up with a new American security think tank and a vision for that. And you see us moving in a different direction in the 21st century. Can you lay that out for us?
Well, there are
in 2 sentences.
In 2 sentences. The first sentence is that I think in the 21st century, national security has got to be framed in much broader terms. So one of our first programs at CNAS, when we established it in 2007, was, I think it was one of the first energy and national security issues, understanding that our energy picture was actually going to fundamentally affect our national security and security dynamics around the world. We also, at the time, you know, when you look at the think tank world, the think tanks are clustered at the political ends of the spectrum. That's where the funding is and so forth. You go to the centrist middle, or those that are trying to create bipartisan dialogue, and it's a little desert-like at times. There are a few big established ones, but we felt there was room to start trying to build more critical mass, a place where Republicans and Democrats could come together and actually debate issues on their merit, a place where the civil-military dialogue could happen, because there's a huge gap. Only 1% of our population serves in the US military, and that dialogue needs to be happening. So we felt there was space for a different model. We're small, we fill a niche, but we have, I think, been very successful because we have had a new approach.
And of course, it's very prescient to be talking about energy a few years ago, because that is at the center of the current crisis we're in, Ukraine and Russia. Can you talk about that? What is the thinking behind the sanctions? To what extent do you think they are effective? And will it have an impact isolating Putin by going from a G8 to a G7?
Yeah. So, you know, Putin has committed an act of international aggression, and I think we have to present Putin with a choice, which is, if you want to be integrated into the international economy, you want to be considered a great power on the world stage, there are certain international norms and rules of the road and laws that you have to respect. If you choose not to go down that path, you will become increasingly isolated, and it's going to hurt you politically and it's going to hurt you economically. Now, that kind of pressure does not come together overnight. These things, as we've seen with regard to sanctions in Iran, for example, take time to work, but they can be very effective. The sanctions that have been started on Russia are very, very narrow. They're targeting the key individuals around him, their ability to move money, their ability to travel, and so forth. I think what the US and the EU have rightly held up is the prospect of much more serious biting sanctions should Russia go beyond Crimea and start to move into eastern Ukraine. At the same time, I think the administration's done the right thing to politically isolate Russia, basically saying we're not going to meet as G8. Russia's out of the G8, at least for now. We are going to focus on meeting as a G7 as an alternative. We are going to reassure our NATO allies and bolster our defenses on the NATO border and so forth. But the real play is it's a long game. I mean, what Putin has done may seem very satisfying to him and very popular in Russia in the short term, But every country in Europe is now going to counterbalance. They are going to seek to diversify their energy supplies away from Russia. They are going to seek to diversify their financial dealings and become less dependent on Russia. So over the long term, he has basically created an acceleration of Russia's decline.
And do you think this is a good time to be cutting the defense budget?
You know, I am...
Put you on the hot spot?
I believe that the sequestration levels that are in law take us down to too low a level.
Too low a level.
To too low, the level is too low, the risk is too high. Of course, coming out of more than a decade of war, it's appropriate to have some degree of drawdown in the defense budget. But I think there are several things that are different today. One, it's not a terribly peaceful environment. You look around the world, whether it's terrorism, proliferation, wars in the Middle East, uncertain futures in Asia, and so forth. There's a lot of security challenges out there, and we need a robust military, preferably as a deterrent and reassurance force. Secondly, the nature of the defense budget, more than half the budget now goes to personnel, compensation, retirement, benefits, and so forth. So less and less of the budget is actually available for real capability investment, readiness, modernization. And now you add on top of that the budget pressures and the fact that Congress has not given this secretary the authorities that previous secretaries have had to manage drawdowns in the past. He hasn't been given the authority to reshape his civilian workforce. He hasn't been given the authority to close excess bases. He hasn't been given meaningful retirement incentives to try to help people move voluntarily. So he's got his hands tied. He's got less of the budget to work with. He's got a very demanding security environment, and the Congress has him going down, even his budget going down farther. So I think the administration's right to ask for an additional $115 billion over the next 5 years to try to reduce the level of risk that we're starting to assume in both readiness and modernization.
When you look out across the landscape, we could spend, we're supposed to be here for 15 or 20 minutes. And by the way, I do want to take questions this time. So please have them ready if you want to drill down on these issues. When you look out across the landscape of Syria, Iran, the Ukraine, Russia, the buildup of the Chinese military, what worries you most?
There are lots of things to lose sleep over. But I think that the two things I would say are a flashpoint that seems small that could escalate out of control. And the other one is something that we're not paying enough attention to now, or we don't talk about it much in the media, for example, but I think the president just spent a lot of time focused on this, and that is policing up all of the loose nuclear material that's around the world that could potentially fall into the hands of terrorists. You look at what's happening in Syria, where we've gone from a civil war to now a war that's threatening to destabilize the neighboring countries and becoming a broader regional Sunni-Shia war, to creating a safe haven right in the heart of the Middle East for al-Qaeda's affiliates. That is a very worrisome picture. And you see al-Qaeda groups morphing, they're North Africa, Yemen, and so forth. It is not impossible to create an improvised device if you can get your hands on the material, and there's still too much material out there and too poorly secured. So if the one thing that really keeps me up at night that's nobody talks about, nobody really thinks about, that's the one that gets me.
Speaking of the Middle East, is Iraq lost when you look at the rise of terror there?
I don't think it's lost, but it really depends on Prime Minister Maliki recalculating. He has chosen to use his opportunity to pursue a very sectarian agenda and to try to marginalize the Sunni population in Anbar province, and that's created very fertile ground for al-Qaeda affiliated groups to come across the border again and sort of create chaos there. I think there's still an opportunity for him to reverse course and reach out, but that door is not going to be open forever.
You know, when we talk about Syria as a classic case of where American reluctance to intervene has come to the fore, and contrast that with Iraq, I wanted to get your own personal view of when the U.S. as the world's superpower should militarily intervene.
I mean, there's no question that we have a very unique leadership role to play in the world. There is no country that can catalyze coalitions and international action to go after shared problems. But I think what we're what we're relearning is that the military is not the only instrument in our toolbox. I think the Iran sanctions experience has reminded us of that there are economic tools, there are diplomatic tools, there are many tools in addition to the military. I don't think anyone seriously was arguing for a full-out U.S. military intervention into the middle of a Syrian civil war.
But an airstrike.
Well, okay, but let's come back to that.
Okay.
But I think the question is, short of that, what's commensurate with our interests? My own personal view is that earlier in the conflict, there were options to empower and assist some of the more moderate opposition elements. And I think that while we did some, in retrospect, I think we will come to believe we did not do enough. And so, but it's very hard, hindsight's 20/20, but the options are certainly much more narrow and much more difficult now in Syria.
Than they were 2 or 3 years ago when Hillary Clinton was suggesting we intervene. I'm getting hand signals, so I'm going to make a jarring U-turn to your personal life, but I also then want to get a couple questions on policy. And you stepped down largely because of family. It was too difficult to manage what you were doing here with raising 3 young children, and we were having a conversation at the table about some of your thinking behind that. Tell the story about your son, and can women have it all?
So first, just to clarify, at the same time I was serving at the Pentagon, my husband was the deputy secretary at the VA. So there was no, extra bandwidth between us. We do have 3 kids. They were younger then. And they were good little soldiers for a long time. But I think I started to feel that although I was having a peak experience, as was my husband career-wise, and there was a point at which it was too much. There were signs that it was too much for the kids to handle. And the story I told over dinner is my youngest, who was at the time, I think in 4th grade, I had basically we'd both missed every single school event he'd had all year. I'd finally promised on a stack of Bibles that I would be at the poetry recital in the spring. And the night before the poetry recital, which I'd had in my calendar for months, the White House called a meeting on Iran that my boss had requested at exactly that time. And so I went home and told my son, I'm so sorry. I burst into tears, floods of tears, just, I can't take it anymore type of conversation. And so I emailed the Deputy National Security Advisor, who also had 3 young kids at home. I said, here's the situation. I hate to make this, your concern, but he was great. He immediately rescheduled the meeting. And not only did he reschedule the meeting, when I showed up the next day, there was a goodie bag waiting for my son with a note saying, on behalf of the president, we want to thank you for sharing your mommy with us. And here's the White House M&Ms and I hope I don't get him into trouble for giving the White House M&Ms, a White House pen, and a White House pad of paper, and a little yo-yo. And it was just,
But it just bought you 6 months.
6
you said
months,
that was it.
6 months more for my little guy. He was, going to hang in there because.
And then you decided you just couldn't do that.
And then it was time. It was time.
But it won't always be time. I mean,
yeah, but in terms of the having it all, I mean, Anna Marie and I have debated this on stage before, so she's heard this. I completely respect her point of view, and I agree that we as a society.
This is, by the way, she's talking about Anne Marie Slaughter,
Yes.
who was a top State Department official who argued, who also left for family reasons, and argued that you can't have it all. So.
See, I argue that we can have it all, and we do, and actually, people like Anne Marie and I do have it all, or have had it all. We're very blessed, but you can't always have it in equal measure all at the same time. There are trade-offs. What we have to do as a society is better enable women to make those choices, to even have the luxury of having this conversation and being in these positions. And that's where I really agree with Anne Marie, that we can do much, much better. And while I was in the Pentagon, I tried to institute some work-life balance initiatives to try to get at that, for people beyond myself.
I want to take one question. Anybody?
That's putting the pressure on.
Do you see the situation in Crimea and the situation with Russia as a possible entree to changing the situation at the Security Council in the United Nations and maybe breaking the logjam there?
Excellent question. Did everybody hear that?
It is a great question, and I can certainly see it accelerating the debate to open up and expand the Security Council. Getting to the point where you could imagine removing a heretofore permanent member, that would be a very heavy lift. And I think Russia would have to go a lot farther down the road to really become a pariah, to get to the point where people would be even, to be considering that realistically, in my view. That's an excellent question. This is an example of an institution that needs to be updated and adapted for the 21st century to reflect a very different world than the one that was present when it was created.
So one interesting thing when we were talking, I didn't realize this, that my son's an Army Ranger. Women cannot be Army Rangers, which I knew that, but they actually can be fighter pilots.
Yes.
So when you go back in and you're at the top, are we going to see women Army Rangers?
I hope that before that time even comes, if it ever comes for me to have a chance at public service again, I hope that we will move towards that in the near term. I know that this is the whole question of women being able to apply to be Army Rangers, go through the physical tests like everybody else, is being actively debated in the Army right now. And I certainly hope it doesn't take years and years to get to the right answer on that.
And last question, you have to place a bet on whether Hillary Clinton will be the Democratic nominee.
I certainly hope so. My admiration for Secretary Clinton went even higher than it had been before, which was pretty high, just watching her in action as part of President Obama's cabinet and doing that Secretary of State role. I think she's a very extraordinary leader. And I think this country is ready for a woman to be president and for the other half of the population to know that they too can dream of becoming president. All the little girls in the country, can dream of being president and can actually get there one day.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you.